History has a way of burying the things it cannot explain. In the humid, salt-strewn air of 1857 Charleston, 3 women in heavy black veils did the unthinkable. They didn't just break the law, they broke the unspoken social code of the South. They walked into a human auction, pooled their fortunes, and bought a single 18-year-old man named Samuel. What happened next wasn't a story of labor or cotton. It was a descent into a private hell of obsession, isolation, and a secret so disturbing that a judge ordered the records sealed for half a century. Textbooks won't tell you about the house on Longitude Lane, because this isn't just a story of slavery. It is a story of 3 women who thought they could own a man's soul, and the 2 who paid for that arrogance with their lives. If you're ready to walk through the doors that history tried to bolt shut, stay until the end. In the sweltering heat of the 1857 South Carolina summer, the Charleston slave market on Meeting Street functioned with a rhythmic, terrifying clinicality that defined the era. On July 14th, the routine of the traders was interrupted by the arrival of 3 women dressed in the heavy, suffocating black silk of mourning. Catherine Whitmore, Eleanor Ashford, and Margaret Cordell did not look like typical speculators, yet they moved through the crowd with a singular, chilling purpose. They were not there to look for field hands to till the earth or domestic workers to maintain their sprawling, inherited estates. Instead, they stood before the auction block as a unified front, their presence signaling a radical departure from the traditional patriarchal norms of the South. Their husbands were dead, and in their newfound widowhood, these women had decided to pool their vast financial resources for a purchase that defied logic. When Lot 47 was brought forward, the air grew thick with a curiosity that bordered on scandal among the local plantation owners. Samuel was an 18-year-old of remarkable stature, but it was his eyes, intelligent, steady, and literate, that made him a high-risk investment for any traditional buyer. The bidding began at a standard rate of $300, but it quickly escalated into a realm of absurdity as the widows countered every offer. They did not bid against one another, they spoke in a rehearsed rotation, their voices cold and unwavering against the gasps of the gathered crowd. Men who needed strong backs for their tobacco fields dropped out in confusion as the price soared past the $1,000 mark. For a single field hand, the cost had become a grotesque display of wealth, suggesting that the labor they sought was not physical, but something far more intimate. The fall of the auctioneer's hammer, at $1,050, marked the beginning of a secret history that the city would eventually try to erase. The widows paid in cold, hard cash, a move that ensured no bank or mail executor could immediately interfere with their unconventional acquisition. Samuel was ordered to walk exactly 10 paces behind them as they departed the market, a visual performance of the very system they were secretly planning to subvert. They did not lead him to any of their well-known family plantations, where overseers and prying eyes might report on their unusual activities. Instead, they turned toward a secluded townhouse on Longitude Lane, a property they had quietly secured through a private business arrangement months prior. As the heavy oak door closed behind them, the public world of Charleston was shut out, leaving Samuel in a world with no established rules. Inside the shuttered townhouse, the traditional master-slave dynamic was immediately replaced by a domestic cooperative that felt more like a psychological experiment. Catherine, the pragmatic leader, explained that Samuel was to be their shared companion and intellectual bridge to a world they were forbidden from exploring. He was provided with fine evening clothes, a private room, and books that would have been considered contraband in the hands of any other enslaved person. The widows sought to fill the void left by their dead husbands, not with new marriages, but with a controlled, private source of enlightenment. They wanted a confidant who was legally bound to them, someone who could offer conversation and perspective without the social consequences of a public relationship. It was a purchase born of a desperate desire for agency, yet it relied entirely on the absolute commodification of Samuel's humanity. This initial keynote of the story reveals the complex intersection of gender, power, and the terrifying flexibility of the institution of slavery in the urban South. By purchasing Samuel together, the widows bypassed the social necessity of male heirs or new husbands, using their status to create a private sanctuary. However, this sanctuary was built on the foundation of a human life, bought at a premium for the sole purpose of emotional and intellectual service. The absurdity of the price tag was the first warning sign that the arrangement was not a business transaction, but an obsessive pursuit of a fantasy. As Samuel sat in his well-appointed room on that first night, he understood the grim reality of his new position. He was no longer a laborer of the field, but a high-priced prisoner of 3 women whose grief had curdled into a dangerous, law-defying need for control. The house on Longitude Lane stood as a silent sentinel, its windows perpetually shuttered against the prying eyes of Charleston's high society. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with the scent of expensive beeswax and old parchment, creating a sanctuary that felt entirely disconnected from the humid streets outside. Samuel was not relegated to a cellar or a shack. Instead, he was installed in a second-floor suite furnished with mahogany and fine linens. This physical comfort was not an act of kindness, but a calculated effort to refine the merchandise they had paid so dearly to acquire. The widows had created a world where the brutal reality of the South was masked by the trappings of European sophistication. It was a gilded cage designed to cultivate a version of Samuel that could satisfy their specific, unspoken hunger for intellectual stimulation. Catherine Whitmore established the initial order of the household with the cold precision of a merchant overseeing a valuable shipping manifest. She dictated a rigid schedule that divided Samuel's time into blocks of service, ensuring that each widow received her fair share of his presence. During these hours, Samuel was tasked with reading aloud from the classics, translating Greek texts, and engaging in debates on philosophy and art. These were the very activities that the widows' late husbands had often excluded them from, viewing women as intellectually inferior. By making Samuel their student and teacher, they were engaging in a silent rebellion against the patriarchal structures that governed their lives. However, this rebellion was rooted in a deep irony, as they used the power of ownership to force a man into their service. As the weeks bled into months, the intellectual veneer of the house began to crack under the weight of a mounting, claustrophobic intimacy. Eleanor Ashford was the first to deviate from the script, increasingly ignoring the books in favor of long, probing questions about Samuel's soul. She would sit for hours in the dim light, watching him work, her gaze lingering far longer than the boundaries of the cooperative officially allowed. The conversations shifted from the abstract theories of Plutarch to the painful, personal realities of Samuel's upbringing on a distant Virginia plantation. She began to treat the townhouse not as a shared business venture, but as a private confessional where she could unburden her own lowliness. This shift toward the emotional realm introduced a volatile element into the house that Catherine could not easily quantify or control. The shuttered nature of the house was not merely to keep the neighbors out, but to keep the 3 women's growing rivalries safely tucked away. Margaret Cordell, the youngest, began to compete for Samuel's attention by commissioning expensive evening clothes and treating him as a high society escort within the garden walls. She sought to transform him into a living monument of her own status, a move that directly challenged Catherine's vision of a quiet, intellectual retreat. The air in the parlor grew thin with the unspoken tension of three women vying for the focus of a man they legally owned. Samuel, ever observant, realized that his primary duty had shifted from reading books to navigating the fractured psyches of his three mistresses. He was no longer just a companion. He had become a mirror in which each woman sought to see her own desires reflected. By the time the autumn leaves began to fall, the house on Longitude Lane had become a pressure cooker of conflicting expectations and suppressed rage. The windows remained closed, trapping the heat of their arguments and the coldness of their silent treatments within the wood-paneled walls. Samuel's room, once a symbol of his elevated status, now felt like a high-altitude observation deck from which he watched the cooperative dissolve. The women were no longer unified by their widowhood. They were divided by a jealousy that the law did not have a name for. They had sought to create a utopia free from the demands of men, but they had instead built a laboratory for obsession. As the first locks appeared on the outside of Samuel's door, the true nature of their domestic cooperative was finally revealed as a dark, inescapable nightmare. The fragile facade of the domestic cooperative shattered on a humid Tuesday evening when the first echoes of violence rang through the house. Catherine Whitmore had arrived hours ahead of her scheduled time only to find Eleanor Ashford in a state of unscripted intimacy with Samuel. The sight of Eleanor's hand resting upon the young man's arm as he read from Dante's Inferno ignited a fire of betrayal. What was supposed to be a sterile intellectual arrangement had devolved into a raw and bitter contest of emotional possession. The air in the parlor grew thick with the vitriol of women who had forgotten that their bond was built on gold. Their voices, once unified in the auction house, now tore at the silence like jagged blades of broken glass. The argument that followed exposed the deep, irreparable fractures that had been festering beneath the surface of their shared mourning veils. Catherine accused Eleanor of violating the sanctity of their agreement, while Eleanor countered that no contract could govern the movements of the heart. Margaret was summoned to mediate the dispute, but her suggestion to grant Samuel his freedom only served to deepen the crisis. Catherine understood with terrifying clarity that freeing their merchandise would invite a legal scrutiny that would surely lead to their ruin. To release him was to hand over the evidence of their social transgressions to a magistrate who would show no mercy. They were no longer three partners in a venture. They were three prisoners of a secret that was growing teeth. By late September, the house on Longitude Lane had transformed from a sanctuary into a site of cold, calculated psychological warfare. The boundaries that had once kept their schedules orderly were now used as weapons to isolate and punish one another for perceived slights. Catherine, ever the pragmatist, realized that the emotional instability of her partners had become a threat to her own physical survival. She began to watch Eleanor with a clinical detachment, noting the way her friend's mind seemed to fray under the pressure. The cooperative had become a liability, a sinking ship where the cargo was a man who knew far too much. In the darkness of the second floor, Samuel listened to the shifting floorboards and realized that a body was required to end the stalemate. The transition from spoken threats to lethal action occurred with a silence that was more terrifying than any scream of rage. Catherine visited a pharmacist under the pretense of a vermin infestation, her face a mask of widowly virtue as she purchased the arsenic. She did not act out of a sudden fit of passion, but out of a desperate need to consolidate power. Eleanor Ashford was the first to fall, her sudden decline attributed to a broken heart and an accidental overdose of laudanum. As the doctor signed the death certificate without a second thought, the remaining two widows shared a look of mutual, murderous understanding. The first death had not solved their problem. It had merely simplified the mathematics of their collective and growing guilt. The aftermath of the first murder left the house in a state of permanent, shivering dread that no amount of candlelight could dispel. Margaret Cordell now moved through the hallways like a ghost, her eyes darting to the shadows where she expected to find her own end. Catherine had successfully removed one liability, but the silence of the house was now filled with the unspoken accusations of the survivor. Samuel remained the pivot point of the tragedy, observing the way the remaining women navigated the blood-stained remains of their original vision. The cooperative was now a hunt, and the predator was no longer hiding behind the polite language of a business arrangement. As the locks on the doors were reinforced, it became clear that the house would not stop until it was empty. Samuel sat in the quiet of his room, listening to the heavy footsteps of a woman who had transitioned from a mistress to a murderer. He realized with chilling clarity that his literacy and refined education, once his shield, had now become his greatest liability in this house. Catherine viewed him no longer as a companion, but as a walking piece of evidence that could send her to the gallows. He began to calculate the mathematics of survival, a mental tally of every pharmacy visit and every muffled scream he had overheard. In the system of the South, a slave's word was worth nothing, yet Samuel knew that a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous player at the table. He spent his nights memorizing the rhythms of the house, preparing for a confrontation that was now mathematically certain. The atmosphere turned glacial as Catherine consolidated her grip on the remaining members of the fractured and blood-soaked cooperative. Margaret Cordell, paralyzed by the sight of Eleanor's empty chair, became a trembling shadow who sought refuge in Samuel's presence during the forbidden hours. She spoke of escape and whispered of the North, but Samuel recognized these as the desperate delusions of a woman marked for death. He saw Catherine watching from the corners of the hallways, her eyes assessing Margaret's growing instability with the cold eye of a butcher. He knew that any alliance with Margaret would only tether him to her inevitable and fast approaching fate at Catherine's hands. Survival required him to remain a ghost within the walls, an observer who offered comfort while preparing his own path to the exit. The second act of violence unfolded when Margaret attempted to reclaim her agency through a confrontation fueled by terror and a misplaced pistol. Samuel listened from behind his locked door as the voices in the parlor rose in a final, jagged crescendo of accusation. He heard the clatter of a dropped teacup and the heavy, rhythmic thud of a body collapsing against the hardwood floor of the garden. Catherine did not call for help. She simply waited for the silence to return before dragging the evidence toward the river. From his window, Samuel watched the carriage depart into the darkness, carrying the second widow to her final resting place in the Ashley River. He stood in the center of his room, realizing that the cooperative had finally been reduced to two survivors, the killer and the witness. When Catherine returned, she found Samuel not cowering in fear, but sitting calmly in the parlor, as if he were the master of the house. The locks had failed to hold him because he had mastered the mechanics of the house. Just as he had mastered the Greek poets, he did not beg for his life when she entered covered in the mud and silt of the riverbank where she had dumped Margaret. Instead, He presented her with a legal and social ultimatum that shifted the power dynamic of the room in an instant. He spoke of probate courts and the specific rules of property testimony that could bypass the usual bans on a slave's voice. He had found the one legal loophole in the South that allowed a piece of property to speak against its owner. The negotiation that followed was a cold exchange of assets, stripped of all the pretenses of the intellectual, cooperative they had once imagined. Samuel demanded his manumission papers and a ticket to Philadelphia in exchange for a deposition that would validate Catherine's lies. He offered her a clean slate, a narrative of accidental overdoses and tragic suicides, at the price of his own permanent and legal freedom. Catherine, recognizing a mind as calculating as her own, saw the elegance in this final transaction of human flesh and blood. She sat at her desk and began to write the documents that would officially end the nightmare of Longitude Lane. By morning, the mathematics of survival had balanced the books, leaving one woman with her reputation and one man with his life. The legal echoes of the house on Longitude Lane did not fade simply because Samuel had crossed the Mason-Dixon line into a precarious freedom. While Charleston society accepted the convenient narrative of two tragic widows succumbing to grief, a different story was brewing in the courtrooms of Richmond. Thomas Ashford, Eleanor's brother and a formidable lawyer, refused to believe that his sister's vibrant spirit had been extinguished by a mere accidental overdose. He possessed the resources and the legal acumen to peer behind the polished mahogany doors of South Carolina's elite. His arrival in Charleston in 1858 signaled the beginning of a cold, methodical dismantling of the lies Catherine Whitmore had so carefully constructed. The sealed records were not a sign of silence, but a testament to the explosive truth that was threatening to erupt. Thomas hired a former Pinkerton agent named Marcus Webb to sift through the whispers of neighbors and the ignored logs of local pharmacists. Webb's investigation uncovered a pattern of behavior that contradicted the image of the grieving, charitable widow that Catherine projected to the world. He tracked the delivery of late-night supplies and interviewed former staff members who remembered a young man's face in the upper-story windows. The discovery of Eleanor's final, unmailed letter provided the first piece of physical evidence that the domestic cooperative had turned into a prison. This document described a growing fear of inevitable consequences, a phrase that Thomas recognized as a cry for help from a woman who knew she was trapped. The circumstantial evidence began to pile up like dry kindling, waiting for a single spark to ignite a full criminal inquiry. The district attorney was eventually forced to open a formal investigation, as the pressure from the Ashford family made the scandal impossible to ignore. Catherine maintained her composure with a terrifying, iron-willed discipline, greeting the sheriff's deputies with the practiced grace of a victim of circumstance. She played the part of the benevolent mistress, claiming she had freed Samuel to honor the progressive and misguided wishes of her dead partners. However, the investigator's eyes remained fixed on the inconsistencies in the doctor's reports and the strange timing of the riverbank deaths. Every interview was a chess match where Catherine used her social standing as a shield against the mounting accusations of murder. She knew that as long as Samuel remained silent in the North, the state's case was a hollow shell without a heart. In the 7th Ward of Philadelphia, Samuel lived a life of quiet defiance, teaching children in a small schoolhouse, while the ghosts of Charleston hunted him. When Marcus Webb finally tracked him down, he offered $500 and the promise of justice in exchange for a single, devastating testimony. Samuel looked at the investigator and saw not a savior, but a man asking him to step back into a system designed to crush him. He understood that his appearance in a southern courtroom would be a suicide mission. Regardless of the truth he carried in his mind, he chose the mathematics of life over the hollow satisfaction of a revenge that would likely result in his own public execution. His refusal was the final seal on the case, ensuring that Catherine's crimes would remain legally unproven for eternity. The case was eventually dismissed for a lack of direct evidence, and the records were sealed for 50 years to prevent the scandalization of the Southern legal system. Catherine returned to her husband's tobacco business, a woman who had successfully navigated a triple murder through sheer, cold-blooded calculation and the exploitation of the law. The house on Longitude Lane was sold, its blood-soaked parlor repainted to hide the stains of a cooperative that had failed its 3 ambitious creators. Samuel's silence was his ultimate victory, a rejection of a world that only wanted his voice when it served the interests of white justice. The story remains a haunting reminder of the secrets buried beneath the soil of the Old South, where the cost of freedom was often paid in blood.